In order to start knitting a top-down sweater in a raglan style like this, we have to start from the neckline. And as you can see, there is a ribbing for the neck, but we're going to start from here and then do the yoke part basically up to here, and then do the body and then the sleeves. So that's why it's called a top down. To start, you need to cast on a certain number of stitches to begin your work. And in order to do that, you need to do some calculations. I'll show you how I calculated to start the cast on process, because you need to figure out how many stitches to start with. And it will depend on what kind of style you want, how deep or small or how tight or loose you want your neckline to be, and also what size you want. This is the back of the sweater, and for me, I decided that I want this length to be 20 centimeters. This size will depend on how big you want that neck to be. And remember, when we're starting, we're not starting with the ribbing part that goes around the neck. So you might want to leave like a little bit more room for yourself if you want that thing to be really, really thick, like how I did in this V-neck sweater. The back of the sweater will be 20 centimeters. And the calculation that I use every time is to third that for your shoulders. Since 20 centimeters times 1/3 is 6.67, that's going to be the length of the shoulders, like this. Once I decided that, I looked at my gauge. So make sure you make a gauge block so that you know what size or how tight or loose that you actually knit. So use the needle size that you're going to be using and try to make it into at least a 4-inch or 10 centimeter block so you can count them. For mine, when I use a 5mm needle, my gauge was 22 stitch for 10 centimeters. And using that, you can calculate how many stitches that you need for that specific length that you want. So for me, I wanted the back to be 20 centimeters. So what I would do is 20, the length, times the gauge, the stitch over length. So it'll be 22 over 10. So 20 times 22 over 10 equals 44 stitches. But in order to do a broken rib pattern, I need to have an odd number. So I decided to go with 43 stitches instead of 44. And then I would do the same thing for my shoulders. So the shoulders are 6.67 centimeters. So what I did was 6.67 times 22 divided by 10, which gives me 14.7 stitches. And then I rounded it up to be 15 stitches. Shoulders are going to be 15 stitches, back is going to be 43 stitches, and then you can see the red marks in this diagram that I drew. These red marks are markers to separate and show you where the different sections are. So this is going to separate from the front to the seam stitch, to the shoulder stitch, to the back stitch,
to the seam stitch, to the shoulder stitch, and so on.
It is up to you how much you want your seam to be. For me, I decided to do with 1 because I personally just don't like the seam to be very, very noticeable. So this is what it looks like when you do 1 stitch seam. Since we're doing a V-neck, we're not going to start with the entire neck circumference. We're only going to start with 2 stitches for the front, do the shoulder, the back, shoulder, 2 stitches for the front. So it's going to not be a full circle when we start. And the reason why we're doing two stitches to start in the front is so that we can increase easily and have that marker in place that will separate the front and the seam. As you can see, this is really the formula that I will start to cast on my first row. So I will cast on 2 stitches for the front, place a marker to separate them from the 1 stitch seam, place a marker, 15 stitches for the shoulder, marker, 1 stitch, marker, 43 stitches for the back, marker 1 stitch, marker, 15 stitches for the shoulder, marker 1, marker, and then 2 stitches for the front. So once you've done your calculations, you can start casting on following the tutorial. And I use a long tail cast on method. If you have not done that before, if you want to try that out, there's so many good tutorials on YouTube, so I really recommend looking up one. If you don't want to start with a long tail cast on, that is totally fine as well. Okay, let's get started. One trick that I use for the long tail cast on is to measure out 3 times the length that you want to start with. So for my sweater, my neck circumference for the shoulders and the back was 33 centimeters. So I'm measuring out 3 times of that, give it some wiggle room, and then tie a knot. Then I can start my long tail cast on. Do 1 stitch, so you have 2 on the needle, and then put a marker. Then cast on 1 stitch for the seam stitch. If you want 2 or 3 stitches for the seam, you can cast on 2 or 3 depending on what you want. Then put a marker in and cast on the number of shoulder stitches. I am casting on 15 stitches for my shoulder. For every section, count the stitches to make sure that you have the correct number of stitches to begin with. You don't want an error from the beginning, from the first row. After putting in the marker, cast on 1 for your seam stitch. Put another marker, and then cast on the number of stitches that you need for the back based on your measurement and your gauge count. I am casting on 43 stitches. Before putting on the marker, count the stitches to make sure that you have the correct number of stitches. When you do, put a marker in, cast on 1 stitch for your seam stitch, put another marker in, and now do the stitches for your shoulder. I am doing 15 stitches. After counting to make sure that you have the correct number of stitches, put your marker in, then cast on 1 seam stitch and put another marker in. Then cast on 2 stitches for the front part. Now you finish casting on the front sections, the shoulder stitches, and the back stitches. For the second row, we are working on the wrong side. As you can see, these little bumps on the bottom, which indicates that you are on the wrong side. In the second row, we are doing all purl stitches. There are no increases, so just work purl stitches across the entire row and just move the markers along. Now that we finished row 2, we're going to flip the work around and work on the right side on row 3. We will always be knitting the first stitch on the right side. After knitting 1, we will purl 1. Then we meet the marker to the left. So we're going to be doing a M1R increase because we're increasing to the right of the marker. So this is a raglan increase. Move the marker, knit the seam stitch, move the next marker. Now we are increasing to the left of the marker, so we are doing an M1L, L for left. Whenever we are working on the right side of the work, this is when we are going to be doing these raglan increases for all 4 of our raglan seam stitches. After doing the M1L increase, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and repeat until we meet the next marker. We finished the shoulder stitches. We purled on our last stitch and we met our marker to the left. We're increasing to the right of the marker using the M1R method. Then we move the marker, knit the seam stitch, Move the marker to the right needle, and we're going to be increasing M1L. So after the increase, we're going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and continue this ribbing pattern until we reach the next marker for the shoulders. We purl the last stitch, and then we do a M1R increase to the right of the marker. Move the marker over, knit the seam stitch. Move the next marker over, and then increase M1L. After the increase, we purl 1, knit 1, and then continue this ribbing pattern for the shoulder stitches until we meet the marker for the seam stitch. You should also be ending this stitch section with a purl stitch. Oh my gosh, my marker flew out. Then we're going to do a M1R increase to the right of the seam stitch marker. Move the marker over, knit the seam stitch, move the next marker, and then do an M1L increase. Then we purl the next stitch, knit the last stitch, and we're done with row 3. Let's turn the work around and start the next row. For this row, there are no increases and only purl stitches across the entire row. Simple enough, right? If you don't personally like to do purl stitches that much, don't worry, because once we connect it into a circle and we're working in the round, we'll only be doing knit stitches on this round instead of purl stitches. We're now on the 5th row. The first stitch is always a knit stitch. And remember, for the V-neck, we are increasing every 4 rows. So now that we're on the 5th row, we will be increasing right after the first stitch. Do an M1L because we are increasing to the left of the first stitch. After the increase, do purl 1, knit 1, and then right before the marker, we will increase M1R. Then move the marker over. Always knit the stitch for the seam. Move the marker over. Do an M1L when you're on the left side of the marker. And then continue the ribbing pattern for the stitches. Make sure to check row 3, 2 rows below what you're working on, to see which stitch is knit and purl. On this row, row 5, every section should start with a knit, not including the increase, and end with a knit, also not including the knit stitch. After knitting the last stitch on this section, do a M1R increase before the marker. Move the marker, knit the seam stitch, move the next marker, and then do a M1L increase. Then knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and repeat this step until you meet the next marker, where you will do the M1R increase, move the marker over, knit the seam stitch, move the second marker, do a M1L increase. Then we knit 1, purl 1. And you need to increase for the V-neck increase because this is the 5th row. Remember, we are increasing the V-neck every 4 rows. On the wrong side, which is row 6, we are purling every single stitch with no increase. From now on the right side, after you knit your first stitch, look for the rows below you to see if you need to knit or purl the next stitch, the second stitch. So here I have a purl on the third stitch, so I'm going to knit the second stitch, purl the next stitch. And then again, remember on the right side, always increase before and after the markers. Again, always check the rows below or the previous rows to make sure that you are knitting and purling on the right stitch. Continue repeating this ribbing pattern and increases before and after the markers till the end of the row. And you'll be repeating this for every right side of your work. I am now at my last stitch marker. Because I am on the right side of the stitch marker, I'm going to do M1R, move the marker, knit the stitch, move the marker, and do an M1L. And then looking at the previous rows, I know that it is a purl, knit, purl, so I'm going to purl the next stitch. We can see the V-neck forming. This is the shoulders, and that's the back. And then the front is the front side of the V-neck forming. So again, on every wrong side of your work, we're going to be purling every stitch with no increases. For the V-neck, we're increasing every 4 rows, and it can get tricky on how you count them, so I'm going to show you how I do it. Here you see the V of each knit stitch, so that is row 1. And then there's the second row, third row, fourth is where we increased. And then again, 1, 2, 3. So we are on the 4th row now, and we are on the right side of the work, so we are going to be increasing for the V-neck. You can also tell by looking at where the increase happened. After we knit the first stitch, we're going to do a M1L increase to increase our V-neck. And then once you do that, we're going to continue stitching our ribbing and increases before and after the markers as we've been doing. So continue increasing in this way until the stitch count on the front and then the back becomes the same. This is what my sweater looked like once the front 2 pieces stitch counts and the back stitch counts were the same. And the length became 8 inches from the neckline to the end of the V-neck. Once you reach this stage, come to part 2 of the video tutorial to learn about how to connect the neckline and continue working on your sweater.